let's go ahead and get started. We've got some preliminaries, so I'll go ahead and get us going. Welcome, I'm Walter Sterling, as many or all of you know, member of the faculty and the Dean of St. John's College in Santa Fe, and I want to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture in the Dean's Lecture and Concert Series. And this lecture is also supported by the Carol J. Worrell Annual Lecture Series on Literature that we hold at the college. In a moment, I'm going to invite my colleague, Andy Kingston, to introduce our lecturer. And I just want to say again that we continue to be grateful for the opportunity to connect in this way, as hopeful and eager as we are to reunite our campus community. It's been a wonderful opportunity for us to connect near and far and to continue our tradition of a weekly lecture and question period afterwards. We hope that many of you who have tuned in for the lecture will stay for the question period. We'll take a very short break after the lecture, and then we will just continue the question period on this platform. Same link, same webinar. And with that, I'm just going to say briefly that I'm very happy that Nicholas de Warren is joining us. Again, he's lectured at the college before. I count him a friend of the college and remember fondly that lecture. And I'm very happy that we have the occasion to think together about Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, which is one of the peak moments of our seminar reading list and our senior seminar in particular. And with that, I invite my colleague from the faculty, fellow tutor, Andy Kingston, and friend of our lecturer, to introduce the lecturer.
Thank you, Dean Sterling, and welcome everybody. Thank you for coming this evening. It's great to see so many people here. And hi, Mom and Dad. I see Mom and Dad are here, Nicholas. It is my great pleasure to welcome my good friend, Nicholas de Warren, back to St. John's College. It's wonderful that we can have this opportunity to be together and hear from him even in this virtual space. Professor de Warren is professor of philosophy and Jewish studies at Penn State University and previously served as research professor at the Husserl Archives and the Center for Phenomenology and Continental Philosophy at the Institute of Philosophy at Catholic University of Leuven. Author of over 60 articles and scholarly contributions, his work ranges from phenomenology and political philosophy to literature, aesthetics, and ethics. He is the co-editor of numerous anthologies, including New Approaches to Neo-Kantianism, Philosophers at the Front, Phenomenology in the First World War, and New Phenomenological Studies in Japan. He is currently completing a book on the impact of the First World War on German thought, with a particular emphasis on German Jewish philosophers. Professor de Warren's first book, published in 2009 on Husserl and the Promise of Time, has recently appeared in a number of translations. His Momentary Breathlessness in the Sadness of Time was published in 2019. And I just finished reading, this afternoon in fact, his most recent book, there we go, Original Forgiveness, which was published last month and is a beautiful and I would say timely work that I suspect informs his lecture this afternoon. I highly recommend everybody pick up a copy. I'm sure the campus bookstore would be able to help you with that. With that, please help me welcome Professor Nicholas de Warren to give a talk entitled Atrocity Exhibition, Satan and Redemption in the Brothers Karamazov.
So thank you, Andy, for this very kind and generous introduction, as well as to Dean Sterling for the invitation to speak. And let me also just thank very quickly David Carl and Amanda Romero, who were very forbearing in my email delinquency over the past year and a half as we were toggling around to try to get this date for this lecture. As Dean Sterling mentioned, I had been out to Santa Fe a number of years ago, and I have very fond memories of just a very lively intellectual environment there. And of course, it's a shame that we're not able to be together in person, but I do hope nonetheless that we'll be able to have an interesting discussion on a topic and a book that I know that many of you are currently reading and thinking about, which is Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. So what I thought I would do for this lecture, for this talk, is to sort of anchor thinking about the question of evil, and specifically the figure of Satan or the devil that, as you know, enters onto the stage of the novel, as a way to think about rethinking what do we mean by evil. So try to motivate a different approach to think about evil in connection to the problem of forgiveness. So as Andy mentioned, indeed, many of the ideas that I want to explore with you and discuss with you this afternoon are sort of the continuation of a thinking about the question of evil, the question of forgiveness, the unforgivable, that I tried to work out in the book that Andy just mentioned. I'll presuppose that we have a kind of familiarity with the narrative, the plot of the Brothers Dostoevsky, so I won't sort of tell you what that story is about in the detail. As you know, it's a universe unto itself. And I should also say that I've tried to sort of frame my comments in sort of little modules, so I'm not trying to be exhaustive, but trying to sort of have a few points to sketch a constellation, which will also hopefully facilitate a discussion so we can, people can find their own points of entry. And I'm happy as well to talk about the innumerable scenes and other characters and figures in the novel that I won't be able, for obvious reasons, to speak about this afternoon. So that's a bit, get a sense of sort of the method, if you wish, to what hopefully is not too much of madness. So let me just begin sort of in media res, straightforward. Let me begin with a scene from the Brothers Karamazov, which is the parting of ways between Ivan and Alyosha at the crossroads underneath a streetlight. And this is in chapter 5, book 11, part 4, called Not You, Not You. So I just want to begin with that scene, and I sort of want to anchor my reflections with that scene, and then I will move through a number of other scenes and end with a scene. That's sort of how the talk is structured. So just to remind you or recall what's going on in this scene, Ivan has just confronted his brother Alyosha with his declaration of a kind of irrevocable departure. And he does so by confronting him. Again, it's quite dramatic. It's at a crossroads, there's a light. So we have really the sense of light and darkness staged very theatrically. And Ivan confronts Alyosha as about he's to take leave by saying, quote, "I cannot bear prophets and epileptics, messengers from God, especially you know that all too well." Now, of course, these words that Ivan addresses to Alyosha are especially venomous, given that Alyosha just attempted, if you remember, to convince Ivan of his innocence. So he just had attempted to convince Ivan that he is not the one who murdered their father. And indeed, Alyosha tells Ivan, "God has sent me as a messenger to tell you that, so to convince you of your innocence." And after a moment of silence, when Ivan is registering what Alyosha has just came to, in a sense, to anoint him innocent of the murder, Ivan begins to shake. Again, I'm just following the description that Dostoevsky gives in the novel, and violently takes hold of Alyosha by the shoulders, and he begins to speak in a, quote, rasping whisper, and he says this in a rasping whisper: "You were in my room at night when he came. Confess you saw him, didn't you?" End of quote. Now, I don't know Russian, and therefore I can't comment on the Russian word here translated as rasping, but the English term, so that he speaks with a rasping voice by saying, "You were in my room last night when he came, confess," I would say, suggest what I call the interpolation of another voice from within, as if there were two voices within Ivan that are grating, as if there's a kind of the interruption of a voice by the ventriloquism of another voice. This is the sense of rasping. Now, Alyosha, and again here just to remind you of the scene, fails to grasp Ivan's reference. So Alyosha doesn't understand what is my brother talking about by coming up to me, taking me physically by the shoulders, and in this very strange voice, as if something or someone else is speaking in that voice, accusing me, in a sense, of having spied on him, having seen what happened, last night, that night, when he, we don't know who, or Alyosha doesn't know who that is, came to see him. And indeed, Alyosha says, you know, what are you talking about, Mitya? So he uses the Russian Mitya, the diminutive, which is a sign of intimacy among brothers and things like that. So Mitya. And is sort of perplexed as to, in a sense, what is this reference to this visit? And he then asked Ivan, who is he? Like, who are you talking about that came and visited you? I don't know what you're talking about. So I'd like to just sort of begin with this scene where at the parting of ways between Ivan and Alyosha, Ivan confronts Alyosha with somehow having spied and witnessed what I will call the secret of his identity. And the secret of his identity entails this visitation that he had that no one else at that time knows about. Such that the question that Alyosha poses to Ivan, not knowing, you know, what on earth is my brother talking about? Who is he? Emphasis on the he, that as with so Dostoevsky's novel, the he pivots in many different directions, namely, who is the murderer of the father, Fyodor? Who is Ivan? And who is he, this as yet unidentified mysterious visitor to Ivan? Now, earlier in the confrontation, and here I'm just sort of embellishing and thinking through this scene, earlier in this confrontation, when went up to his brother, again at the crossroads, and asked his brother, who do you think was the murderer of our father, given that Alyosha has tried to convince him that Ivan wasn't the murderer. Alyosha explains that it couldn't have been him, and Ivan then, with some amount of incredulity, says, do you mean that therefore the murderer, including the mad epileptic idiot Smerdyakov, so names the, and Alyosha immediately then has a visceral reaction to hearing that name as he's trembling. The interesting is that Alyosha neither confirms Ivan's naming of Smerdyakov, who he might have been referring to as the one who killed his father rather than Ivan. Okay, the vicissitudes of technology. So just to, again, apologize for the bad connection that broke up. Basically, I was just wanted to emphasize that at the moment when Ivan says, are you talking about Smerdyakov as the murderer? There's a kind of ambivalent visceral reaction on the part of Alyosha, who doesn't acknowledge that, as if he's disturbed to hear the name. And Ivan then comes up to him and cries out, who? So again, this emphasis of who, the doubling of the word who. And what I'd like to suggest, this is just a kind of an extended setup, that this question, who is the murderer, and the ambiguity of Alyosha not wanting to recognize Smerdyakov, Ivan not wanting to recognize himself as innocent, really emphasizes what I've been calling the question of the secret of who is Ivan. And the sense that the question of who is Ivan is inseparable from disambiguating, if possible, the question of, is Ivan and Smerdyakov somehow the same or different? So at what point does Ivan end, and at what point does Smerdyakov sort of begin? So it introduces for us very clearly the figure of the double, the idea of Ivan as doubled by another, as his other that he doesn't clearly recognize, as the secret to identity, the secret to the identity of the murderer. And here, just to show you the really elegant complexity of Dostoevsky's thinking, this figure of the double, Ivan and Smerdyakov, centering around the ambiguity of the question, who is Ivan, who is the murderer, and who is he that visited Ivan, is then itself reflective of a doubling of Ivan and Alyosha as two brothers. Because you may recall that Ivan and Alyosha are brothers from the same mother, so the second marriage of Fyodor, the father, from Sofia Ivanova, a shrieker, a kind of village holy fool, whereas Dmitri is actually their half-brother, who is from the first marriage, and then Smerdyakov is most likely their half-brother from a muteless homeless village girl that Fyodor, the father, had basically raped. So here, this is to sort of get us to the problem that I just want to think about, that this scene of the parting of ways between Ivan and Alyosha, where the question of who is the murderer as a disturbing question that throws into profile the ambiguity of the identity of Ivan, the ambiguity of the identity of Alyosha's relationship to Ivan, that in a sense, what this illustrates is the profundity of Dostoevsky's reflection on the question of evil in the Brothers Karamazov, which can be illustrated sort of figuratively to the two figures of Alyosha and Ivan, who both come from the same womb of the Holy Fool. They have the same mother, such that it's really trying to think about this sort of deep problem of whether good and evil stem from the same source. So how is it that two brothers who come from the same mother and the same father, one represents the figure of forgiveness, the sort of almost Christ-like figure of Alyosha, the other is Ivan. And here I think this will get us to the heart of the question I want to at least try to make an attempt to think about, that it's sort of Dostoevsky's reflection on one line from the Old Testament, from the Song of Solomon, namely that love is as strong as death. So the good is as strong as evil, and of course, reciprocally, that death is as strong as love. So this question of the tension between good and evil, and ultimately the origin of good and evil is here, I think, what is in play with these two characters. So having just sort of set the scene with this confrontation and the question of the who, introduce the question of who is the visitor, we'll come back to in a moment, as a way to identify within one specific episode and anchor the problem of good and evil in Dostoevsky. Now, what I'd like to do is say some sort of philosophical reflections on how I'd like to propose that what's philosophically interesting, indeed original, about Dostoevsky's novel is the way in which we can sort of read it as an attempt to rethink fundamentally how to conceive of evil. And that's going to have something to do with this doubling the character of Ivan. Now, I'd like to sort of bring onto the forum of our discussion what I consider to be one of the very exceptional insights of a French philosopher, not well known, but quite brilliant, called Vladimir Jankélévitch, who is a contemporary French philosopher of the 60s, 70s, and died in the 80s, who proposed to rethink the question of evil through the problem of forgiveness, where the problem of forgiveness is going to be both a kind of, not just a response to evil, but an optic. So some optic in the sense that we get a clearer understanding of the problem of evil when we look at it through the problem of forgiveness, and specifically through the problem of the unforgivable. And here, I'll be just very brief, just to sort of delineate some philosophical ideas that then I want to sort of set into motion by entering back into Dostoevsky's novel. The basic claim of Jankélévitch is that rather than consider evil according to what we might call three established models, if you wish, or paradigms of thinking about evil in the Western tradition, one is, and I'll just name them just to give some reference point, sort of the Kantian conception of evil as a form of heightened narcissism and egotism, what Kant calls radical evil. So evil is the condition or situation when I do what I shouldn't do by making an exception of myself to the law. So I say the law, what one should do doesn't apply to me. I'm special because I'm going to pursue my own self-interest. So let's call that evil as a kind of supreme narcissism or egotism of the self that elevates itself above the moral law. Another conception of evil is the traditional Christian conception of evil, stemming from St. Augustine. St. Augustine is the philosopher I talked about 10 years ago, so there's a connection here, which is that evil has no reality. that evil is the privation of being, and that stems from the theological assumption that if God is all powerful and all good, and God created all being, then God himself or itself could have never created evil. And the third conception, and all three of these conceptions, Jankélévitch wants to sort of replace with another way of thinking about evil, is the idea that evil is a kind of metaphysical cosmic force. So what, at least in the history of Western religions, was understood as Manichaeanism, that evil isn't the expression of our subjectivity, evil isn't the lack of being, evil is something like a force, a kind of force in the world that then possesses us, that takes us, etc. Very briefly, what I find really interesting in Jankélévitch, which I'm going to sort of try to propose, clarifies to some degree the question of who is Ivan Karamazov, who murdered the father, and then positioning Alyosha as the figure of forgiveness vis-a-vis this figuration of evil, is that Jankélévitch proposes a conception of evil that I would like to call the notion of evil as the spectrality of evil, or another way to think about it is the idea that evil is a kind of split subjectivity. So the sense is that it's not simply the affirmation of oneself or the expression of something that is our own interiority at the expense of the moral law, but it's also not something that's external to us. It's precisely the way in which the one who does evil is sort of split or bifurcated from themselves. This might sound very abstract, and I hope to make it a bit more concrete by looking at Ivan Karamazov in a moment, but I think that in our contemporary culture, we have sort of gestures to this conception of evil, the idea of evil as a split subject, as a kind of spectrality of evil. You might remember the scene from the film The Lord of the Rings, or if you read the novel, when Frodo Baggins is first entrusted by Gandalf with the ring. And as he puts it on his finger, there's this really nice scene in the film where he puts on his finger and immediately the ring calls his malicious self, his kind of, the kind of inner demon of our narcissism that we all have within us. So it calls out that root of evil, which is our narcissism. And then this image splits where Frodo Baggins then sees the eye of Sauron that calls to him. So the ambiguity is the evil that calls forth something about myself does it call for something that's inside of me? Or does it call from something outside of me? So is it the root of my evil comes from me, or does it come from the eye of Sauron? And so it's this ambiguity of whether it is inside or inside. Another example, which I'll mention just to give a bit more concreteness to this idea before we return to the Brothers Karamazov, is if you remember the figure of the Joker in the Batman film, The Dark Knight, which of course was brilliantly and tragically played by Heath Ledger. That could also be seen as a way to think about the subjectivity of evil as split from itself, as obscure. So it's not strictly speaking narcissism, and it's not really driven by self-interest. Though what's interesting about the Joker figure is that it also illustrates how our culture has completely medicalized or psychologized evil, insofar that we immediately understand or interpret the Joker as a figuration of evil through the notion of madness, through a psychological concept. And of course, what's really interesting about Dostoevsky is that Dostoevsky is really at that threshold, whereas you remember Ivan Karamazov is described often as being afflicted by psychological condition of depression. He's somewhat schizophrenic and psychotic. So it seems to be very modern. It's a very psychological portrait of the one who does evil. But on the other hand, as we'll turn to in a moment, there's this real metaphysical dimension. So it doesn't reduce the subject to pure psychology in the way that you might say in our contemporary culture. This is what I would call sort of the medicalization or the psychologization of evil. That the evil is the person who is mad or who is psychotic. In Dostoevsky, there's something really metaphysically hard about evil that one has to come to terms to, which can't be reduced to just the psychology, though of course the psychology will allow us to see how that metaphysical dimension somehow manifests itself. So having just sort of set up the scene, the question, who is Ivan, as a way to introduce the question, what is evil, focused on the question, who is the one who does evil? What is it to be evil? Which of course is a way to think about the question, what does it mean to be a human being? Now I'd like to sort of return now to the Brothers Karamazov in order to suggest that this idea of what I'm calling the spectrality of evil and split subject is a profitable way to understand the figure of Ivan as double, the doubling of Ivan. And the doubling of Ivan in two senses, Ivan and Smerdyakov, and almost the inability to discern where the subjectivity of Ivan begins and ends vis-a-vis Smerdyakov. And then the other doubling, which is going to be what is alluded to in the scene that I just commented on, the visitation by the devil or Satan to Ivan. So these two moments of doubling is what now I want to suggest illustrates or gives a certain literary heft, if you wish, to the notion of evil as a split subject. So here, and again, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm just going to now move to another scene to sort of anchor these ideas, not so much to exhaustively develop them, but at least to set them up such that then we can have a discussion. So the next scene I sort of want to look at in this very sort of anemic constellation, just to get a certain figure motivated, is of course the very famous other confrontation of the many confrontations between Ivan and Alyosha, and this is Ivan's rebellion. So this is, in a sense, the sort of pièce de résistance, you might say, of Ivan's rebellion, not only against Alyosha, it will be focused against Alyosha, but really his sort of metaphysical rebellion against the universe, and as you all know, against God. Now here, I'll just remind you that what's interesting about this confrontation of Ivan's rebellion is that Ivan seems to have ensnared his brother Alyosha. You'll remember that Ivan is in a tavern waiting for his brother. His brother Alyosha initially is not looking to meet Ivan, but wants to meet his other brother, Dmitry. He chances upon Smerdyakov, who then tells him to go to the tavern, and that's the sense in which then he meets Ivan. So it's both accidental and fated that they meet. And again, as you remember, I won't go through the details, the whole confrontation of Ivan's rebellion, the section calls Ivan's rebellion, really turns around what is undoubtedly the most canonical scene moment of the Brothers Karamazov, and that is the way in which Ivan appeals to the useless and cruel suffering of children, the death and torture of children, as a kind of leverage for his rebellion against God, that I cannot accept a moral universe that has any kind of rationality, be it divine rationality, the best of all possible worlds, or a purely rational structure that in the long run, evil will harmonize with the progress of humankind, that when I appeal to the suffering of children, that in a sense, that is the moment of absolute metaphysical revolt. Here, I'll just mention very briefly, I'm happy to come back to this later, that I think that there is one way to read the Brothers Karamazov, where what is central about the Brothers Karamazov is not just the plot of the death of the father, which of course is also very metaphorical. God becomes murdered by the human, by the eruption of evil among the human. But I think that one could argue that the Brothers Karamazov is also fundamentally about the death of children. And just to sort of remind you, there are really three children's deaths which are absolutely central to the development of the narrative. The first occurs quite early in the narrative, which is when the elder Zosima is receiving a group of village women who are coming to receive his blessing, and encounters a village woman who comes and bemoans the fact that her young son has just died. And speaks about how, you know, there's this sort of, it's unforgivable that children die, and it's unconsolable. And she speaks of looking at his shoes and wishing that he was there. At which point the elder Zosima deploys a kind of theological discourse of consolation. That, you know, he says, you know, poor woman, you know, rest assured that your son is now up in heaven with God in a kind of joy of reunited with the Father. at which point Dostoevsky, who always inserts a kind of ironic subterfuge to various positions, has the old woman say, and here I'm quoting quite liberally, well, that's quite interesting, Father Zosima, that you say this, because that's exactly what my drunk husband tells me. So there's no difference between the theological consolation for the unforgivable death of a child and drunkenness, the drunkenness of her father. The other death of the child, other than the scene of the death of children that Ivan uses to leverage his theological and metaphysical revolt, is of course the key scene, or the key event, as you know, which is the death of the little boy Ilyusha. And again, remember that Ilyusha is the boy whose father is in a kind of conflict with Fyodor Dostoevsky, and mistakenly thinks that when he first sees Alyosha, that it's actually Dmitri, and throws a rock at him. And it's precisely the death of the boy Ilyusha, the speech at the stone at the end of the novel, where the pronouncement, the very important sort of moral axis of the novel, that we are all responsible for each of us, and I more than others. So the wisdom of Zosima that is imparted to Alyosha, the key idea for someone like Levinas, that this is precisely what Alyosha embodies, that he takes responsibility for the death of Ilyusha, the little boy, though he is not the one who orchestrated the circumstances for his death. His death is both natural, he dies of some illness, but it's also inferred that he dies because of the abuse that his father has suffered at the hands of Fyodor Dostoevsky. So it is neither just a natural death, nor is it an unnatural death, i.e. provoked. I think it's trying to really emphasize this sense in which the death of children is something fundamentally unacceptable. And it's something for which we have to take responsibility, even if we're not directly implicated, which is the figure of Alyosha. Within these two images of the death of children, there is then the death of children that emerges with Ivan in Ivan's rebellion. And here, again, I'm going to be very brief, largely in the interest of time, but also to keep things open for discussion. What I find very salient about this confrontation, where Ivan, in a sense, corners his brother Alyosha and performs what I want to call an atrocity exhibition. So you remember that Ivan corners his brother in the tavern and starts listing atrocities that he's been reading in the newspaper. Turkish generals who are meaninglessly, cutting up children, wars. And it's really interesting that Ivan says that I'm the collector of these stories. You see, in a sense, he's the collector of dead souls, who then takes all of these stories of horror and suffering and derives a kind of pornographic pleasure from showing them. In a sense, if Dostoevsky were alive today, of course, all of this would happen online through media. That we have this purent fascination to see evil, to see suffering, much like Ivan, both to be shocked by it, to be horrified, but in a sense to aestheticize that horror and gain a certain kind of moral pleasure in the very outrage that we have from it. Such that I think what Ivan represents is this interesting combination between what I will call the pornography of evil, that we want to see evil, we want to hear about evil, we want it to be visible, and a certain abstraction, a kind of intellectualization. So it's a combination of pornography and intellectualization. It really is a kind of contemplative attitude, in terms of which then he rejects the meaningfulness of there being a God. And as you'll recall, he then sort of corners his brother by saying, after he puts forth yet another sort of lurid story, the story of the delight of the general who gets pleasure, cruelty from the torturing of the child, which is doubled in the very telling of the story itself. So Ivan telling this story is the general who is deriving pleasure from torturing his brother. So it's another figure of the doubling. It's almost as if the story itself becomes alive in Ivan torturing his brother with these images, these pornographic images of evil, and then corners. This is what I will call the cornering of forgiveness, where he says, here I'll quote, he says, well, what should we do with him? The general who has tortured a child and taken pleasure from it. So really senseless cruelty. I'll quote, this is Ivan to Alyosha, "What should we do with him? Shoot him for our own moral satisfaction. Speak, Alyosha." So he forces him to answer the question of, should you forgive the unforgivable? Ivan presses, demands, and really coerces Alyosha to speak. And then Alyosha, cornered, then says, yes, we should shoot him. And then Ivan gets pleasure and he says, quote, "See what a little Satan is sitting in your heart, Alyosha Karamazov." So no longer speaks to him in the diminutive form of his brother, but in the proper form of address. So I'd like to sort of emphasize that this is precisely how evil manifests itself as the unforgivable in terms of blasphemy against forgiveness. And the blasphemy against forgiveness is precisely to corner forgiveness and to corner forgiveness with the unforgivable. So I think what Dostoevsky is doing here is it's a kind of crescendo of evil, and the pure manifestation of evil is the one who seduces the figure of forgiveness to not forgive the unforgivable. So it's the refusal of forgiveness. It's the refusal of the possibility of the forgiveness of the unforgivable. And just a little note, for those of you who are familiar with Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, you have a very similar kind of reflection. You may remember that Lizaveta, the woman, basically the prostitute that the man from the underground most likely rapes in the brothel, when then she comes to his apartment to forgive the unforgivable, then the man from the underground, out of shame of having been forgiven, then refuses to be forgiven. So the unforgivable is not just the committing of evil, the unforgivable is the refusal to be forgiven for having done the unforgivable. In a classic vocabulary of Christianity, the unforgivable is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. So it's the refusal to be forgiven for having committed the unforgiving. And that is what is unforgivable. That is what is truly unforgivable. So I think what this sets up is that Ivan is, in a sense, the figure of the Antichrist. Ivan is the figure of the Antichrist who, again, doubled in the story of the Grand Inquisitor, comes to Alyosha, who is the figure of the new Christ, in order to seduce Alyosha into believing that the Antichrist is the true Christ. So this is the figure of how the Antichrist is the adversary who tries to convince, and this is precisely the point of the Grand Inquisitor story, that the Grand Inquisitor story that then Ivan tells, the little fable he says that he has been writing, especially for Alyosha, that this is, Ivan is the Antichrist who is trying to seduce Alyosha, and that figure of seduction is precisely to convince Alyosha that the figure of Christ is actually the Antichrist, and that the figure of the Antichrist is precisely Christ. And this occurs through the inversion or the perversion of the logic of forgiveness. Namely that rather than being Christ as the figure who not only forgives the unforgivable, but who accepts to be forgiven for the unforgivable on behalf of the human, the Antichrist becomes the one who cannot forgive God for the unforgivable, but the unforgivable that human beings have themselves committed. So that is the ultimate rebellion, to accuse God of the unforgivable when we should stand accused and take responsibility for the unforgivable. Now with this, I want to sort of bring to a kind of end, again, this attempt to flesh out, and pardon the pun, theological pun, I mean, really flesh out the body of Christ, the working through of the figure of Christ as the figure of forgiveness in confrontation and conflict with the Antichrist. So Ivan and Alyosha, by now sort of saying a few things about the scene that was referenced with the scene that I began with, when Ivan at the crossroads said, "I know you've been spying on me. I know you've seen that I receive a visitation from him." And remember, at that point, Alyosha has no idea what his brother is talking about. Now, for me, one of the greatest moments of the Brothers Karamazov is precisely the scene where Ivan is in his hut, in his little house, and Satan or the devil comes and visits him. So after the rebellion, after the tavern, after he believes that he has been exonerated of the murder, Smerdyakov has accepted. Smerdyakov, as you know, kills himself, though Ivan at that point doesn't know that yet. But you'll remember that we have this really amazing scene where Satan, or the devil, as it's called in the translation, knocks on his door and enters, and there's this conversation, this encounter between, I'll call him Satan, or the devil, and Ivan. And here, what I sort of want to just sort of emphasize is that what's quite well done from a literary point of view is that the devil does not come with, horns, typical sort of iconography of the devil. He enters as a kind of dandy. He's sort of, his dress is sort of garish. He has there's a certain style to him, but there's also something that's a bit unusual. It's an image that the other Russian writer, Mikhail Bulgakov, picks up in The Master and Margarita, which is again another novel where Satan shows up in the novel. What I'd like to propose is that this really is the way in which Dostoevsky wants to reflect on what we might call the reality of evil, the real presence of evil, because that entire scene is written in a way where I think as a reader, we can't clearly decide whether this is a pure hallucination of Ivan. So is Ivan just projecting and hallucinating in his delirium that Satan is coming to visit him and he's having a discussion? For those of you who are familiar with Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, it's another wonderful scene where, as you know, Adrian Leverkuhn also has these encounters with the devil, and there the devil takes up different disguises, shows up as different avatars. In Thomas Mann, of course, I think the devil who comes to visit as the other, the alter ego of Adrian Leverkuhn, is a kind of moment of irony. It's sort of the irony, the self-ironic structure of Leverkuhn to himself. In Dostoevsky, I think there's something much more metaphysically challenging. It's the ambiguity about whether evil is actually a kind of reality that is not simply the projection of the human imagination, but precisely is a kind of reality that makes the question of whether we just hallucinate it, whether it's just a projection, so whether it's just psychologically, that haunts us. We don't know. It's undecidable in that regard. And this is what I would call the ontological ambiguity of Satan, as in between something that might have being, that might actually exist, and something that has non-being, and therefore requires a medium of visibility. Dostoevsky calls him the sponger of visibility. Now here, I'll end with just two more sort of observations. And I would invite you to sort of go back and read that scene. It's very well done. Part of that scene, you think, oh, this is just, Ivan is just hallucinating. But then, objects are being moved on the room. The devil or Satan is saying things that shows that he has knowledge that the character of Ivan could not have, not even unconscious. So it's also not this Freudian idea that it would be the projection of the unconscious. It's a kind of unconscious that is not our unconscious. It really is the other. And the question there is whether Ivan is doubled as Satan and starts to come to see himself as the Antichrist that he has performed in the cornering of his brother in the tavern, and which then he imagines through the story of the Grand Inquisitor. He is the Grand Inquisitor. Now here I'll just mention two things, one philosophical, one literary, and then I'll end my remarks. I think one of the very few philosophers who thinks about Satan as an ontological problem was the German philosopher Schelling. In a set of lectures called The Philosophy of Revelation from 1841, 1842, Schelling has an amazing discussion of the origins of evil, where he thinks about who is Satan, who is the figure of Satan. And there Schelling sort of observes that the word Satan in its original Hebrew means he who contradicts, he who inverts, he who is the adversary. In the book of Job, you may remember that Satan is in the book of Job the adversary who comes to God and says, show me the one who has the most faith and let us put him on trial. In a sense, Dostoevsky rewrites the book of Job, who is put on trial. But the interesting thing that is that the figure of Satan is a spirit. He's a Geist in German, which can also mean that he's a ghost. There's a spectrality, because the German word Geist means both spirit and specter. That Schelling suggests that Christ and Satan are related to each other because he refers to some obscure heretical early Christian texts that name Satan as the elder brother of Christ. So he really thinks of this idea whether Christ had a brother, and that brother was Satan. And Schelling remarks in this regard that Satan is the power of non-being that has to, in a sense, appear through the avatar of visibility of being. So it's not purely something that isn't, it's not something that is, it's something that passes in between. It's a kind of split subject. He says, this I'm quoting from Schelling's lecture, he says, quote, Satan presents evidently a double aspect. He is the nature for which a double representation is not just possible, but necessary. So any description of Satan has to be doubled, has to be split. Ivan and Smerdyakov, Ivan and the Grand Inquisitor. He is double-faced precisely as the deceiver, as the instigator of contradictions and discord, as that which engenders evil, and on the other hand, a principle that is permitted as its means. So what I find really interesting is Schelling's idea of the split subjectivity, the double figure of Satan, which I think appears in literary form in Dostoevsky's figure of Ivan and Smerdyakov. Are they one subject? Are they two? Ivan and the devil. This is undecidable. So I would argue that it's undecidable to know whether we have two characters, Smerdyakov and Ivan, or whether they are the same character who don't recognize themselves as the same. Likewise with the devil, Satan, and Ivan. Now, let me sort of conclude with bringing the brothers back together. So as you know, that after the visitation by the devil or Satan to Ivan, Satan then leaves. And then Ivan hears a knocking on the door, on the window actually. Doesn't know who it is, and it's his brother Alyosha. And Alyosha sort of comes to Ivan to tell Ivan that, look, you're clearly not the one who murdered the father because Smerdyakov has committed suicide. And what's really interesting about this scene, again, I'll just comment on it, is that somehow Ivan already knows that Smerdyakov has committed suicide, though according to the inner logic of the novel, we're not told how on earth he could have known, because in the very moment where Smerdyakov kills himself, that's the very moment where Ivan has been visited by the devil. So it's a kind of inconsistency, I think, that Dostoevsky puts in to raise the question, how does he know that his other, the double, has killed himself precisely at the moment where Satan appears and visits him. The other interesting thing is that Ivan then tells Alyosha, look, the devil just came and visited me. But when he tells and tries to explain that he was just visited by the devil or Satan, Ivan actually lies. So he lies in the sense that he doesn't actually tell Alyosha exactly what happened. He, in a sense, fabricates another kind of telling. So again, I think it's Dostoevsky, the real brilliance of Dostoevsky is always the detail. That on the one hand, Ivan doesn't hide the fact that, and tells his brother, I was just visited by the devil. So he's truthful, but at the same time he lies. So he continues to be the one who sows contradictions. He is the devil. And at that moment, then you remember that Ivan then passes out in cold. So again, it's a kind of psychological deterioration of his condition. And in an amazing scene, Alyosha strips him naked, and they lie together side by side. I think it's a deeply ambiguous scene because you may remember that earlier in the Grand Inquisitor and the rebellion scenes, those two scenes, Ivan had mentioned the story of the John of the Hospitalier, Saint Julian, who then would embrace the lepers. So the figure of Christ who embraces the leper, and that embraces the figure of forgiveness. I'd like to propose that Alyosha here, it's the ambiguity of whether the figure of the good, the whether of forgiveness, who lays side by Ivan, but doesn't embrace him. The question is whether there is any possible redemption for evil through the figure of Christ of forgiveness, as metaphorically put before us in the non-embrace. So it's side by side. So again, it's the line, love is as strong as death, good is as strong as evil. But if love and goodness is as strong as evil, then it doesn't mean that it's stronger than evil. So we have a sense that the reality of evil, the otherness of evil, is not fundamentally redeemed or reconciled. There's no reconciliation. There's just these two moments of good and evil, the two brothers who are one, but in being one, they still remain very separate. And with that, I'm going to end with a quote. Another literary, in a sense, much more eloquent than me, and maybe I should have just started with this quote and said that was the whole lecture. But another way to formulate this idea that I think I find and I'm trying to explain and articulate as what I'm calling the eclipsed subjectivity of evil. The one who is evil is both one and two, Ivan and Smerdyakov, Satan and Ivan, and then the deepest mystery, Alyosha and Ivan. So whether the good and evil come from the same mysterious source. This I want to end as a way to illustrate this, what I'm calling eclipsed subjectivity of evil. I also find it in another wonderful novel by the contemporary Irish writer John Banville, a novel he wrote called The Book of Evidence, which is a very sophisticated sort of retelling of Crime and Punishment in a way. I'm going to read you a long passage and then that will be the end for me. This is a passage of a diary of it's about an individual who murders someone. And not unclear why they murdered. So it has that kind of obscurity of why did Raskolnikov do it? Trying to rationalize it, but there's something else going on. It's a long little passage, I'll read it and then I'll end with that. So this is from John Banville's The Book of Evidence. Quote, by the way, leafing through my dictionary, I am struck by the poverty of the language when it comes to naming or describing badness. Evil, wickedness, mischief, these words imply an agency, the conscious or at least active doing of wrong. They do not signify the bad in its inert, neutral, self-sustaining state. Then there are the adjectives, dreadful, heinous, vile, and so on. They are not so much descriptive as judgmental. They carry a weight of censure mingled with fear. Is this not a queer state of affairs? It makes me wonder. I ask myself if perhaps, and I want to stress this, the thing itself, badness or evil, does not exist at all, if these strangely vague and imprecise words are only a kind of ruse, a kind of elaborate cover for the fact that nothing is there. Or perhaps words are an attempt to make it be there. Or again, perhaps there is something there, but the words invented it. Such considerations make me feel dizzy, as if a hole had opened briefly in the world. What was I talking about? My dreams, yes. There was the recurring one, the one in which, but no, leave that to another time. And with that, I thank you for your attention and look forward to our discussions.
Okay, as we prepare to begin, I just put this in the chat thread, but for anyone new to the platform, we'd love to hear questions live voice. And if you'll raise your hand, you should have a button to do that at the bottom of your browser or app. And then I can turn on your microphone and we can hear from you. Or you can write a question or comment in using the Q&A function. So please, anyone, feel free to begin. We always like to hear from students, but we welcome comments and questions from anyone. And Professor DeWarren, I'll just mention that the connection stayed a little shaky. The audio was fine almost all the time. There were just a couple of little little glitches. The video's a little shaky. So you seem okay right now, but I'll just, I didn't want to interrupt you unnecessarily. I thought the audio was coming through well enough, but just be aware. And I don't know if any moving around would help, but the audio really came through fine. Okay. I see we have a question, and with your permission, I'll just go ahead and read these and kind of cue them up when they come this way, and then you can take it from there. So this is from student Max Fleischman. It seems that a good chunk of the evil done in the Brothers K is done to oneself. I'm thinking of Mitya and his tendency towards self-ruin. Katerina Ivanovna and her tendency towards painful and eventually unsustainable martyrdom. Even Ivan, in rejecting Alyosha's forgiveness, commits evil against himself. You said this is the utmost form of evil. Can you expand on this? Why is this more evil or less forgivable than the murder of children?
Yeah, that's so that's a very complicated question. That's a great question. I mean, you're absolutely right to stress that one of the patterns of evil, or the patterning of evil in the novel that's explored in different ways, and in Ivan this is very clear, the way in which the doing of evil is always a doing of evil against oneself. So there's a kind of self-destructive, if you want to put it in more dramatic terms, in a sense, we don't know ourselves, and because we don't know ourselves, often what we do in the pursuit of what we take to be either self-interest, or in the case of Ivan, a kind of righteous cause, in a sense, always has a kind of boomerang effect where it always produces a kind of self-destruction, or in a sense that it sort of undermines and the very conditions of us achieving what we thought we would achieve. And that's something which, as you know, and you mentioned a number of other characters that I didn't mention, this is something that almost all the characters in the novel, to various degrees, if you wish, are afflicted with, even to some degree, Alyosha. And clearly, this is also almost the comedic refrain of Fyodor Dostoevsky, right? I'm going to jump in headfirst Karamazov style into sort of, whatever situation. So I think there, I mean, I would interpret it this way. Sort of generalizing a bit, I think it sort of reflects this idea, the way in which, at least in Dostoevsky, he doesn't want to simply say that the impulse of evil is a kind of narcissistic. I think what he has in mind is sort of Byron, this sort of romantic, Byronic, almost Milton's idea of the devil, that evil is the affirmation, at times almost noble, of the individual in the pursuit of their own self-interest, indeed their narcissism, by always sort of interjecting this moment of self-destruction, of self-undoing. Then I think it's trying to sort of modulate this question of whether evil is fundamentally of a narcissistic or self-interested type, precisely because it often is the case that when I pursue something, I myself am the first one to suffer. And clearly Ivan suffers from the fanaticism that he has of claiming a kind of moral purity, in sense of this insistence that, in a world in which I can't come to terms with the suffering of children, then I have to sort of reject God, which for Dostoevsky, of course, is a sign of a kind of intellectualism. So I think that that's the sense in which then you might say that there's a kind of element of self-destruction that always shadows the destructive force of evil. And of course, Dmitri is something like that as well. I mean, Dmitri is more of a romantic character, though Dmitri, of course, there is this redemption of Dmitri when he accepts the judgment and says, I will go and be responsible for it. The other thing I'll say to that question, and again here, I mean, it's would require a longer conversation, is what I try to mean by the what is most evil, and it's difficult to compare, but I think that there's a really important argument that Dostoevsky makes about the unforgivable and what constitutes the unforgivable, one way to think about the unforgivable is certain kinds of events or acts are unforgivable, the senseless torturing of children. But then there's this other aspect of the unforgivable, which in a sense, I think for Dostoevsky represents true blasphemy against forgiveness. And that is refusing to be forgiven. So the problem of forgiveness is not simply to forgive the other, but whether the one who is forgiven accepts being forgiven. And of course, the acceptance of being forgiven requires a kind of humility and a kind of dealing with one's own shame, such that in The Man from Underground, the rejection of being forgiven is what is unforgivable. And that occurs from a shame that he has at the shame of having been forgiven. So there's a really interesting idea that when we are forgiven, we are extremely vulnerable to a kind of exposure which produces or can produce a kind of anger against the one and a violence against the one who forgives. And that would then be the category, if you wish, of the unforgivable, not as an evil that befalls someone, but as blasphemy against forgiveness itself. And here, just to sort of anchor it, in the Christian tradition, and of course Dostoevsky is a Christian thinker in a complex way, I mean, it's a Russian Orthodox Christian tradition, this is the idea that the only thing that is unforgivable is the refusal to be forgiven. So Christ will forgive everything, God will forgive everything. But what cannot be forgiven is the refusal to be forgiven, the refusal of the Holy Spirit. And I think that that's what Dostoevsky is reflecting upon in what I have called the cornering of forgiveness by the unforgivable. Namely, if I force you to say here and now, will you forgive the person who has tortured the child, then I am, in a sense, coercing you to not forgive and commit blasphemy against yourself. So that's what I meant by that. For me, I think for Dostoevsky, is sort of the pinnacle of evil, as the unforgivable is the refusal of being forgiven for the unforgivable.
Thank you. We have another question. This one was in the chat thread. If you have that open, from another student, Luke Tyson. What do you think about Smerdyakov's confession to Ivan? He holds on to it until the very end, refusing to do anything but deny accusations if Ivan would try to bring him, Smerdyakov, to trial. This is not a confession and seems instead more like an opposite of Mikhail's confession in the elder Zosima's story, transcribed by Alyosha, of course.
Yeah, so that's another, I think I'm going to say this often, that's another complicated question. So maybe I'll say two things. I'll say just a general observation. So I think that your observation about at what point and under what circumstances is there or is there not a confession by Smerdyakov? Why is there a confession in the end, or at least some? I would say as a general point that there's a kind of, for lack of a better word, a kind of a dance between Ivan and Smerdyakov, which already begins with, again, these really amazing scenes where, if you remember, Smerdyakov is trying to suggest to Ivan that he should kill the father, and Ivan isn't sure whether he's being suggested. So it's always blurry, if you wish, who is influencing or who is speaking to whom. And then once the murder has been committed, and then the sort of, whodunit aspect of the narrative launches, then you also have this dance where both Ivan and Smerdyakov are constantly being presented as evading, sort of obscuring, directly confronting the question of whether they are the ones who are responsible, whether they suggested the other. Until, and that's why I tried to emphasize it a bit too quickly, admittedly, that moment where Smerdyakov then confesses, if indeed it is truly a confession, but at least acknowledges it, the suicide of Smerdyakov, which almost coincides in the temporality of the novel with the visitation of the devil to Ivan. Now, the interesting thing that also you mentioned is Markel. That's a really fascinating. So Markel, I mean, there's many things I could say about this. One is what's absolutely interesting about the Markel episode is that, remember that Zosima, the statement, we should all, be responsible for all of, and I more than others, originally is from Markel. It's what Markel comes to wisdom after abusing his servant and the duel, etc., and sort of having a kind of conversion, a sort of deathbed conversion. And you'll remember that Zosima says to Alyosha, "In your face, I always see my brother." So I think that Alyosha is sort of the resurrection of Markel in spirit, who passes generationally through the words. You remember that Ivan tells Alyosha, "You're always plagiarizing. You're always saying what has already been said." And there indeed is a kind of true confession, because confession is about conversion, and conversion that gives form to a new life. That new life is, in a sense, figuratively, Alyosha, who will be reborn through the words of Zosima that becomes flesh. So I think that the difference is that the deathbed confession conversion of Markel is, confession is about conversion. And in that conversion, then a new life, a new child is born, who continues through the words of the spirit that are continued. Whereas with Smerdyakov and with Ivan, or especially with Smerdyakov, there's not this moment of conversion, where conversion is about rebirth and renewal. And of course, that's going to be the end of the novel, The Speech of the Stone, the new church that is going to be founded on the stone in mourning and responsibility for the death of Ilyusha by the children. And you may know that Dostoevsky had planned on writing another novel and didn't, picking up from that scene of the children.
I see there was a follow-up from the same student, Luke Tyson. Maybe we'll go ahead and take that, and then we'll move to the next question. When Ivan calls himself a scoundrel the night after Smerdyakov claims to have received Ivan's permission, when Ivan is left for Moscow, what do you think Ivan is feeling?
You mean like in that moment, or just?
When he calls himself a scoundrel, I think, what do you think he is feeling?
Well, I think it sort of echoes a bit what we were talking about a moment ago, that again, I'll say it very abstractly, that hatred always involves a kind of self-hatred. And so a kind of accusation or laceration of the self. I think this is a really important feature of Ivan's character, that he cannot suffer himself, and therefore suffers all the more for being insufferable to himself. So part of the, unlike Smerdyakov, who one might say, and again, I have to hesitate a bit, because I want to suggest that one can't stabilize the distinction between Ivan and Smerdyakov. If one could stabilize that distinction, I think one of the things that differentiates Smerdyakov from Ivan is that Ivan really has interiority. Ivan has reflexivity. Ivan is an intellectual who wants to write articles, etc. And part of what it is to have a kind of inner life, or to be complex in the sense of having an interiority, is precisely the way in which I can then suffer myself or find myself insufferable. So I can take a kind of negative attitude towards myself. And that's a kind of ambiguity of the self, that a kind of drama of his inner life, if you wish, that is most likely not the case for Smerdyakov. Though again, I want to just reiterate that what I want to argue is one can't ontologically separate the two, though indeed they are two separate characters to some degree.
Okay, we have another question queued up, but I'll just encourage people again. Love to have any live voice questions if you'll raise your hand, or you can type something into the Q&A or the chat. So this is from George Eckerly, an alum of the college. On the Augustinian evil as lack, non-being, that seems to be Conrad's view in Heart of Darkness, picked up by Eliot in The Hollow Men. And here he gives an example, I think, from The Heart of Darkness. Yeah, so here's a quote from The Heart of Darkness. Whether he knew of this deficiency himself, I can't say. I think the knowledge came to him at last, only at the very last. but the wilderness found him out early and had taken vengeance for the fantastic invasion. I think it had whispered to him things about himself which he did not know, things of which he had no conception, till he took counsel with this great solitude. And the whisper had proved irresistibly fascinating. It echoed loudly within him because he was hollow at the core. Your thoughts on that presentation?
Yeah, I mean, that's yeah, many things I could say. I mean, you're absolutely right that T.S. Eliot and Augustine, it's a very important connection. I'll say this, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, the examples of T.S. Eliot and Heart of Darkness, I think, resonate well with, I'll go back to Augustine and maybe a kind of deep memory of speaking at St. John's 10 years ago when I spoke about Augustine. Didn't speak about evil though. But there in Augustine, you do have this sort of, important moment in the development of thinking of evil, where Augustine, who, as we know, was a Manichaean, so subscribed to a form of Manichaeanism. So, the Manichaeanism worldview is sort of the worldview we find in Star Wars. Evil is a reality that exists, and at a cosmic scale that is in a kind of perpetual struggle with good. And Augustine, of course, then sort of rejects that because it's inconsistent with the premise of Christian theology. But more importantly, and I think this echoes with the T.S. Eliot, the Hollow Men, the idea is that in the absence of having discovered the plenitude of God's love for us and our love for God, then the subject is hollow, the subject is empty. There's something missing. And then the confessions is, I don't know what it is that's missing inside of me, so I try to find it outside of me. Worldly success, et cetera, power. And then when I realize that really the emptiness is inside, what I also realize is precisely because there's an emptiness inside, I'm able to sort of seduce myself to evil. This is how Augustine understands the Adam and Eve story, that the serpent is the externalization of the subject that doesn't recognize itself, precisely because within that hollow space, I can seduce myself. There's space for that seduction, and that seduction comes from a deficiency. Now, what's lacking is not just self-knowledge, so in Augustine's term, that I've discovered the inner man, as he calls it, as opposed to the external man, but that in discovering the inner man, I discover that I stand in a relationship to God, which is one of plenitude. So that's how I would understand the kind of Augustinian metaphor of hollowness and hearing a voice that is myself that I don't hear. What I tried to suggest in Dostoevsky is that what I find interesting about Dostoevsky is that there's this real insistence that evil, unlike in the Augustinian tradition, is not simply conceptualized as the deficiency of something, the deficiency of love for God, the deficiency of self-knowledge, the deficiency of knowing what I ought to do, but that it's also a kind of presence that has a certain, albeit complex, metaphysical status. Complex in the sense we can't really say that it exists, we can't really say that it doesn't exist. And this is the sense in which then the apparition or the appearance of Satan or the devil gives a certain kind of heft to the presence of evil, such that evil is not simply deficiency. Why that's important is that then it sets up a question which I only alluded to, which is in an Augustinian conception of evil, precisely because evil is a deficiency, there's the fundamental hope for redemption. There's the possibility of overcoming evil. But I think that that scene of Ivan and Alyosha next to each other without an embrace is much more ambiguous. It's really ambiguous whether indeed God, Alyosha as the messenger of love, as the new Christ, represents the triumph over evil, or just the ability to sort of maintain that tension that it's as strong as evil, but not stronger. So that would be the way in which it breaks with an Augustinian notion of deficiency and lack. There is a kind of positivity to evil, but that positivity is fundamentally ontologically ambiguous.
Mr. Eckerle has a couple of other questions here, and we'll stay with him until we get another. He asks, why did you name the lecture after the J.G. Ballard novel?
I knew that was coming because I like. So in a bit like, I mean, part of it is that title. Well, I'll just say this since it's a conversation. I was also thinking of the Joy Division song, Atrocity Exhibition, which is of course also a reference to the J.G. Ballard novel. But first of all, it's the title, independently of the J.G. Ballard novel. What I want to say is that when Ivan presents what I'm calling the catalog of horrors, and Ivan says, I'm the collector. I read newspapers and I collect all these stories, and then sort of exhibits this atrocity. It's a kind of pornographic moment of making evil visible. So in that sense, internally within that scene, I think that scene is organized as the exhibition of atrocity. And precisely the exhibition of atrocity in order to provoke what we spoke about earlier, especially in response to one of the questions, the cornering of forgiveness into unforgiveness. So that's sort of the motivation for it. The other allusion to the J.G. Ballard novel is, I mean, you might say that J.G. Ballard's novel is sort of thinking about, the problem of the complete disintegration. So once we move to a point in history where there's a complete disintegration of the possibility of something like a new ecclesiastic church, the possibility of the reform of a new Christianity as a response to the problem of evil that you find in Alyosha, then in a sense, you do have the wasteland with no possibility of redemption. And as soon as you have the wasteland with no possibility of redemption, it also means that the kind of narrativity that you have to engage and talk about evil is going to look very different, namely these condensed, very fragmentary, episodic moments that we're just going to sort of, work through and sort of assemble. That's sort of where we're at. The other thing I'll mention, you may know that J.G. Ballard wrote that novel, as he himself says, after the death of his wife. So it's very much a novel about mourning as well. And here, I'll just mention that you probably know that Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov is also about mourning for the death of his own son. That you may know that Dostoevsky, he had a 3-year-old son called Alyosha who died. He went into a kind of, profound stage of mourning, goes off with the philosopher friend Soloyev, returns, and the figure of Alyosha, in a sense, is a kind of working through the mourning of the death of his son, in a way, of course, configured differently, that the J.G. Ballard novel is also J.G. Ballard working through the mourning of the death of his wife. So there's also there something that's not exactly on par, but it's also a kind of resonance, which I find interesting.
I think this is a follow-up on the comparison. Alyosha lying next to Ivan, Mishkin next to Rogozin at the end of that novel. Thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Dostoevsky is vast, and there's, but I mean, I think you pick up on what I want to argue, that the Christianity, let's call it, or the Christian hope for redemption that is articulated in Dostoevsky is somehow hopeless, because it's not the narrative that, there is a final sort of messianic horizon of redemption. It's not clear that evil is finally overcome, even through the figure of Alyosha. And that's what I think is in that scene. I think you can see that in other novels, in The Possessed. I think you can also see it to some degree, maybe in Crime and Punishment, though the moment of Crime and Punishment I always thought didn't really fit is the figure of Sonia, who really redeems him in Siberia. I think it should have ended before that. It would have been much more consistent, if you wish, with the Brothers Karamazov. But I think that's the ambiguity. The other ambiguity, the moment of ambiguity in the Brothers Karamazov, is Father Ferapont. Because remember, Father Ferapont is the crazy religious figure who's living in the hut eating mushrooms, and who calls into question the authenticity of the Elder Zosima. So you have these moments where in Dostoevsky's novel, the figures that would seem to be the figures of redemption, Alyosha and Zosima, they suffer a kind of an internal critique, which throws into question whether indeed there is a kind of narrative redemption, whether indeed we can overcome evil. And so that's how I would read not only the Brothers Karamazov, but Stroganov, I mean, other figures that seem to be completely unredeemable as figures, as figurations of evil.
One more question queued up here. So again, I just invite folks to keep bringing questions forward either way, raising your hand or writing. Dostoevsky seems familiar with German thought. Characters refer to Schiller. He asked that Kant's critique be sent to him in Siberia. Was he familiar with the Schelling piece you quoted? Jesus' older brother as Satan would resonate with the novel.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. So a couple of years ago, I gave a variation of this lecture in Moscow to a group of Dostoevsky scholars at the Russian Academy. And afterwards, some old Russian scholar, she came up to me and she said, did you know that when Dostoevsky was in high school in St. Petersburg, one of his high school teachers was a student of Schelling? Something I didn't know. So I don't know. I mean, you're absolutely right that he had read Kant, he had read Hegel, like all, educated Russians. I haven't found any evidence specifically that he had read Schelling. The philosophy of revelation, the Philosophie der Offenbarung lectures were unpublished, so he could have not had access to those. But based on just this anecdote that this scholar told me that the teacher, one of his philosophy teachers of Schelling in St. Petersburg, was a student of Schelling, because then at least one can infer that it was not unfamiliar, though it's not clear that therefore one can say that Dostoevsky knew about how Schelling thought about Satan. That we don't know. So I don't think that there's any historical evidence for that. At least I haven't found any, but I think it's suggestive. And indeed, I think when you read, I mean, they've now just been translated in English, the full lectures. When you read the discussion of Satan and evil in the Schelling, you really see that it's very illuminating for, as I try to propose here, reading the figure, the complexity of the figure of Ivan in the Brothers Karamazov.
We have a question from another one of our seniors, Harry Che. If it is so difficult to distinguish between Ivan and Smerdyakov, why can Alyosha judge the former not guilty and the latter guilty? Is this a continuation of or a break from Zosima's teaching?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. So, I mean, part of the question is, I would say that that question is sort of the flip side of the question of, I'll put it this way, of why Alyosha is not unambiguously a figure of redemption of his brother. So he doesn't fully redeem his brother. He doesn't embrace him. And why also Alyosha, in the scene that I commented at length at the beginning, when he hears Smerdakov's name, when Ivan says, are you talking about Smerdyakov? Is, that epileptic idiot, is he the one? Are you believing his narrative? That, as Dostoevsky describes it, there's a kind of nervous reaction, and he doesn't accept it or unaccept it. There, I would say that, again, if one wanted to sort of probe a little deeper, that there's almost a kind of, I'll put it in psychoanalytic terms, a kind of resistance to accept the truth of his brother. And the truth of his brother is that he is a subject, in my terms, who is inseparable from his other, from the double. If that's the case, then the kind of blindness, the inability to judge Smerdyakov might then account for, and I use that term loosely, why then Alyosha is not capable of embracing, of fully redeeming his brother. To put it in Schelling's term, there will always be the indivisible remainder. And that indivisible remainder is always the unredeemable that remains, or that is left out from any logic of redemption. And that then keeps the narrative of redemption always in suspense.
Thank you. At the moment, we don't have a question queued up, so you can take a breath, and it turns out to be a short breath. From Marcus Kinney, how does Ivan's writings about the ecclesiastical courts fit with your characterization of him?
So yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I don't think, not that saliently, in the sense that I read that as indicating from the beginning that Ivan represents a kind of highly intellectual, a kind of a rational figure. So in the sense that, you know, he wants to be an intellectual, he wants to, in a sense, or he represents the figure of rationality. There's a Russian philosopher, a guy called Ivan Golosover, who wrote a book in the 1920s, where he argued that Ivan Karamazov is actually the way in which Dostoevsky sort of introduces Kant's conception of rationality. So he represents Kantian rationality, the destruction of theology by the replacement with rational moral theology, but then the self-destruction of rational moral theology. So Ivan is the self-destruction of reason, namely that in a Kantian universe, you can't accept rationally the unredeemable suffering of children. So I take that this, you know, this sort of document that makes him famous, or he has a certain notoriety, it's talked about, which also is inconsistent, because remember in that discussion, when they all gather, there's the whole thing about whether the argument is consistent, emphasizes the function of the intellect, the intellectualization of Ivan, which then, as it unfolds his character, is connected to what I have called the intellectualization and the pornography. So this puerile fascination with evil as itself a kind of intellectualization. And then, of course, the other literary, I mean, Ivan is the one who's very loquacious. So it's about the loquaciousness of evil that wants to show itself and be visible. And part of that loquaciousness is also then the Grand Inquisitor. This sort of fable, as he says, that he writes. So that's how I see that, his writing that piece about the reform of the ecclesiastical, how that fits into his character, building up the character of what he represents as a kind of type, as a philosophical type.
Thank you. Again, we've got a pause, so if anyone has a question or comment.
Nicholas, I mean, this is Andy again. Can I just? You mentioned in passing in your talk this idea about seeing forgiveness as a lens through which we could talk about evil, and I just thought maybe you could speak a little bit more about. I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but the sort of, is that the priority of a conception of forgiveness in the way that you're thinking? I mean, it's somehow coming before evil. I just want to try to clarify the way you're talking about looking at evil through this lens. Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah. So that's a good question. I mean, you're right that I sort of just mentioned it very quickly. So here, the idea. I mean, I sort of just, that's how I take the idea from. So Vladimir Jankélévitch has this idea that, and for him, it's historically situated. So he's thinking about this in the 60s and 70s, that after the Holocaust, one has to fundamentally rethink the nature of evil in the way that Arendt, Adorno, and others also thought that that's what the Holocaust represents. Like, you know, traditional conceptions of evil just no longer make sense. But the interesting idea there, and this is what I mean by forgiveness, the problem of forgiveness is a kind of optic, is that, if you wish, the point of departure to think about evil from the problem of forgiveness is not the question whether forgiveness is possible, but precisely the impossibility of forgiveness, or the unforgivable. So the argument here is that when we look at the problem of evil through the optic, so conceptually, of the problem of forgiveness, then it forces us to, in a sense, take seriously the unforgivable, And that's a way, this is Jankélévitch's argument, to then sort of reintroduce something which you might say the entire, and this goes back to the question earlier, we were talking about St. Augustine, that the entire Western tradition has, if you wish, repressed. It has repressed thinking about evil as a reality. So that there's something absolute about evil without reverting to a kind of Manichaeanism. So what I mean by optic is when we look at the novel of the Brothers Karamazov, I think that the center of the gravity, the kind of the earthquake in the moral universe, which is centered on Ivan's rebellion, the Grand Inquisitor, the rebellion against God, the rejection of a moral universe, that, as I tried to show, really centers not just on the question of useless suffering, the cruelty of suffering to children, that's unforgivable, but the way in which the unforgivable corners forgiveness to reject the possibility of forgiving the unforgivable. So that would be the way in which then, by looking at the problem of evil through the optic of forgiveness, then it forces us to confront what I think Dostoevsky wants us to confront before, of course, the Holocaust, before Jankélévitch, is rethinking our assumption of evil, precisely that evil can't simply be reduced to a deficiency or privation of being. On the other hand, evil, we don't want a concept of evil as, cosmological force of the Manichaeans. And evil is not Kantian conception of evil. So in that landscape, what's the alternative? The alternative is this complex idea that there is a kind of reality or absoluteness to evil that manifests itself through a subjectivity that is at once possessed of something it cannot possess, but tries to possess itself and advance itself through that being possessed. And that's exactly the ambiguity of Ivan. He's pursuing himself. He thinks that he's self-possessed and completely rational. And at the same time, he's completely being undone by the very mastery and the control, because Ivan is also kind of a power freak. He needs to exercise control over his world, over his brother. So that's what I meant by optic in that sense. We have to think and rethink evil from the problem of forgiveness, from the problem of the unforgivable. If that's helpful.
Mr. Kingston, did you want to?
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, I like the way that you talk about it as a. I'll turn my video on. This is just weird. Sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah. Hi. Yeah. So I like the way that you're talking about it as a kind of optic or as a kind of lens, and I just wonder, and I know I'm sort of just trying to wrestle with the way you talk about original forgiveness in the book, and how this sort of your discussion here, Dostoevsky, situates itself in that conversation, which is maybe too big a question to ask, but it almost looks like there's a priority given by the way you're talking about it, not just a way of looking at it, but a sort of, I don't know if it's logical or ontological priority you're giving to the state of the possibility of being forgiven, or the possibility of forgiveness, that somehow it's not like evil it's not the original sin problem, but there's this original forgiveness problem or something like that. I'm just trying to understand more how is it simply just a way of looking at Dostoevsky, for example, that articulates the situation of the problem of evil in the modern context that we're talking about it, or is there almost a stronger claim that there is in fact a condition of our understanding of ourselves as human beings that somehow this notion of forgiveness is prior in some ways, and maybe I'm stating it too strongly?
Well, you're absolutely right, and this might just be kind of an invitation or opportunity to say something about the idea of original forgiveness, which I haven't talked about. Didn't really play a part in what I was saying, but
forgive me for doing
but yeah, everything is forgiven. You just have to accept it, otherwise then it's unforgivable. No, I'll just say briefly, the core thesis that I try to develop in the book, since we'll talk about the book, which I don't do in the talk I do here, but which I try to show you can find in Dostoevsky, is that, and this sort of connects nicely to a theme we've been talking about in various questions, namely, let's call it one of the dominant paradigms of thinking about evil as privation, as deficiency. that is connected historically to what I claim is axiomatic, that forgiveness is always understood as a response to something. Because I can only be forgiven or forgive after something has happened. So in a sense, in the beginning, we don't begin in forgiveness. Forgiveness only enters the scene once something has happened. And then the complexity of whether one does or does not forgive. Now, what I think is happening in Dostoevsky, I didn't talk about this in my remarks, but it's there, I mean, is that Dostoevsky proposes this idea that from the beginning, and this is why it's an optic, from the beginning, the condition to have a relationship to the other is already to accept the possibility of being forgiven and forgiven, which is interesting because it means that I have to accept being forgiven or forgiving without yet having done anything. And that this, I think, in just to say very briefly, in the novel, these are the two figures of Zosima and Alyosha. Because as I said earlier, Alyosha takes responsibility for the death of the little boy Ilyusha, though he did not cause it. And he takes that responsibility in a way that he asks to be forgiven for it. So the flip side of the statement, we are all responsible for each of us, and I more than the other, is precisely about forgiveness. And this goes back to the question earlier about Markel. Markel, he asks his servant for forgiveness. He says, forgive me for having to command you. And the mother says, you're crazy, you can't do that, you're mad. So that's, and another moment is when the conclave of the brothers enters and Zosima then bows and embraces the earth. That is the figure of, I already asked to be forgiven. So yes, I think that in Dostoevsky, you have this idea that from the beginning, we have to accept the possibility of forgiveness and ask to be forgiven as openness to the other. And likewise, we have to not only forgive the other, though they haven't done anything, but we ourselves have to accept being forgiven. And precisely the refusal of being forgiven is evil. I mean, that's the thing that really exempts us. The other thing I'll say just very briefly is that I also tried to show that if I have to already begin by asking to be forgiven, it's because I already begin with the unconditional commandment of love, which is impossible. So there is something absolutely horrific, traumatic about the Christian unconditionality of love. It's impossible to bear. It's impossible for me to love unconditionally. I know that from the beginning, and therefore I've already betrayed it. So the absolute demand of the good gives rise to evil, and there would be no good without that impulse to evil. That's the way in which Ivan and Alyosha come from the same heart. They come from the same heart of the holy fool, the mother, who is unconditionality of goodness.
Thank you. I do see that we have a question that came in from one of our colleagues, Shannon Chamberlain, so maybe I can interject that here. The part of the scene that you read extensively that always persuades me that Ivan's interest in justice should be taken more seriously than what you called evil porn is the part where he says that mothers cannot forgive the torturers of their children because the mothers are in some sense responsible for the existence of their children. How does forgiveness for an injury suffered by someone else fit into the general paradigm of evil you're articulating here?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, that's interesting. I would say that, I mean, it's worth a longer, I would disagree. So I would say that what I mean that there's the Atrocity exhibition, it's that there's a kind of manipulation of suffering, an instrumentalization of suffering by Ivan in order to coerce and to corner his brother. So on the one hand, there may indeed be a kind of, let's call it a noble or an authentic sense of moral indignation and need for justice in the face of, these incidents of evil. that he tallies. I wouldn't deny that. But what I find complex and therefore perverted is the degree to which this insistence on justice as a rational, and this goes back to what we were saying earlier, that I think Ivan really represents the Kantian point of view of the imperative of, the absolute rational demand of the pursuit of justice. That I think what Dostoevsky does is it shows that there's a kind of perversity to that. It leads to a kind of perversion. This is what I call the self-destruction of reason. So that's a sense in which the rational insistence and the pursuit of justice leads to a kind of perversion, and that perversion exhibits itself in what I'm calling the pornography of evil, which I think Dostoevsky wants us to see, insofar that, as I mentioned, Dostoevsky describes Ivan as saying, I'm the collector of stories. Like, there's something creepy about someone who's reading newspapers, collecting them, fascinated by it. It's a bit too prurient. So that's a sense in which I don't think those two things are irreconcilable. Sense of justice, sense of real outrage, which I think is there, but then the way in which there's a kind of perversity to that, or it becomes perverted. So that's how I would sort of, again, look at the ambiguity of Ivan in that regard. The other thing I would say is that one of the things that's quite complicated, and this goes back to what I was saying about the death of children, that so I think that Dostoevsky is sort of exploring different ways to think about to what degree we can say that the death of children is immoral. The death of the first child in the novel, so the death of the peasant woman's child, is by natural causes, but that's experienced as unforgivable. So it's a kind of a notion that death is a natural evil, and especially the death of children is unforgivable. And then there's this this discourse of theology to console, which, as I mentioned, Dostoevsky undermines when the woman says, well, my drunk husband is telling me the same thing. Deaths that are, especially the death of children, of the cruelty and the torture of the child by, I think it was the Turkish general, which culminates what I call the Atrocity exhibition, is, moral conception of evil. Someone has done something against another person, and that's a moral conception of evil. The death of Ilyusha, insofar that Alyosha takes responsibility for it, is precisely this idea that, on the one hand, it's a natural death because he seems to have died from consumption or naturally, but it's also suggested that he dies because of the harm that was inflicted on his father. So I think what Dostoevsky does is that he describes a notion of death which is not natural death and it's not caused moral death. It's somewhere in between, and that sets up then the way in which Alyosha takes responsibility for something that he himself did not do and asks for forgiveness. And so there, I think it sort of sets up this idea that I think might speak to your comment, that the idea that a community has to be forged as a community of mourning and a community that takes responsibility and, in a sense, is the ecclesiastic body of forgiveness for the evil of the world. That is the start of the new ecclesiastic community at the Speech of the Stone. It's a new body, a new ecclesiastic community of children that is forged in mourning, in remembrance. Remember that Ilyusha says, let us remember Ilyusha, and it's also a community of mourning. So it's a kind of interesting suggesting that forgiveness is not simply interpersonal, but once we sort of expand the imperative to ask to be forgiven for the crimes of others because we are responsible for their being evil, then the agent of forgiveness is no longer just the individual, but can also be a collective. So we can ask to be forgiven for the crimes of our forefathers, so to speak, not because we did it or we didn't do it, but as responsibility for their being evil in the world.
Thank you. See if we have any other questions come in. I think I see one that maybe came in while you were giving the answer earlier about the about Ivan's writing, ecclesiastical writing. We had the comment that his piece argues for all earthly political authority going to the church. Zosima sees it as subversive. Wasn't he writing it from the point of view of the Grand Inquisitor? I don't know. This is
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. That's a really interesting suggestion. Yeah, I mean, I would say that then, I mean, if I mean, that's a really interesting suggestion, because in a sense, it would sort of already telegraph or already signal the kind of the plot, if you wish, or the conspiracy that then manifests itself with the Grand Inquisitor as the one who, as I tried to say, is the Antichrist, the figure of the Antichrist, who tries to, in a sense, invert the relationship between Christ and Antichrist in the pursuit of worldly power. So I think that would fit well in that regard. The other thing I'll just say, because again, I had never thought of that, so I'd have to think more about that suggestion, is that, you know, one of the other lines of debate going on is, you know, there's the debate between the ecclesiastic established church and the starets, and the starets as a kind of an alternative model, as a kind of the true church, the church. So there's also this debate that Alyosha, remember, it goes to the starets to become a follower, a disciple of Zosima, is then sent back into the world, but then returns insofar that the starets, which is the Orthodox Church, you know, Mother Russia of the future. And this is the interesting thing we hadn't talked about at all. In the novel, it's also, you know, the figure of the new Russian church is going to be the salvation for the fall of Europe to Catholicism and Protestantism. And that also involves a critique of the established Orthodox Church, the established official church in Russia. So I think that there's also this complexity in Dostoevsky's thinking, where then Ivan is also going to be a kind of a mouthpiece or a figure for the advocacy of a certain conception of the church, in contrast to his brother Alyosha, who ends up founding a new church, insofar that I read the speech at the stone, you know, like Saint Peter, as the foundation of the new Rome. And the new Rome is the Russia to come. Of course, not Putin's Russia, but the Russia that never happened in the 20th century, which is Dostoevsky's Russia of redemption.
We may be getting close to our end, but we can pause for another minute or two at least and see if any other questions. Have a hand raised. It's Mr. Eckerly. And I will turn on his microphone. I think you're going to need to, yeah. Are you there?
I'm here. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Yes.
It was an interesting thing that you said about how accepting the other person truly as a person is accepting the necessity of potentially being forgiven by them, even if you have done nothing. And would that be an accurate restatement of what you had said?
Yes.
Okay. I just related that to
Yes.
this. Okay. I just related that to the scene in Huck Finn where Huck Finn, I think for the first time, sees Jim as human when he has to actually ask for his forgiveness. And so I was just thinking that that was a very interesting point of view that you had raised, that in order to see the other person as equal to yourself, you have to conceive of the possibility of them being superior to yourself, in the sense that you might need to be forgiven by them. So
Yes, I mean, I would say that that's a, I mean, you formulated a really important, let's say, consequence or implication of this idea of what I've called original forgiveness. And I think I mean, it's a very eloquent sort of description that I'll make it a bit more formal. One of the conditions to recognize another as a human being is precisely to recognize not only them as the one who could forgive me, which means that I already have to imagine or accept myself as the one who could betray them, do harm to them, but also as the one who I would forgive. And precisely those situations in which we are unforgiving to the possibility of forgiving the other is precisely those situations in which the other has been ejected from the human, or we have exempted ourselves from the human. In rage, for example, I will never forgive, and or I will never forgive that other because I don't recognize them as a human for whatever reason. So I mean, I would endorse what you said wholeheartedly as one of the ways in which reinscribing forgiveness at the origin allows us to rethink the conditions of interaction and recognition of us as human beings. So that's exactly, yeah, I mean, in a sense, rage, the unforgivable in rage is a good example, that you become completely inhuman and unable to, in a sense, come to the table to others. When you are unforgiving to the possibility of forgiveness. And that's the subtlety I want, that there's a difference between being unforgiving and being unforgiving to the possibility of forgiveness. And recognizing the other as a human isn't that I already forgive them, they haven't done anything, but I have to recognize in them someone who could be forgiven. And the moment I no longer recognize the other as the person who could be forgiven, then indeed I don't recognize them as a human. I think that's absolutely right.
But also the reflexivity of that, in that the rejection of being forgiven in the character from the Notes from the Underground is also part of that. And so you have to, if you don't recognize yourself as somebody who could be forgiven, then you start going through this disintegration that Ivan goes through.
Exactly. I mean, again, I would just endorse exactly what you said. And the man from the underground, when he refuses being forgiven, and that's a really subtle distinction. It's not that he refuses forgiveness, he refuses being forgiven.
Mm-hmm.
When he refuses being forgiven by Lizaveta, what in a sense he refuses is the true act of love of Lizaveta vis-a-vis the unforgivable, is to bring him out of the underground, to bring him back from the, to bring him into the human, so to speak. And that's exactly right, that the complexity is not just the refusal of forgiveness, but not accepting oneself as forgiven. And the intransiency of not accepting oneself as forgiven is not wanting to be human, not wanting to be part of your humanity, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes both ways. I have to recognize the other, as Huck Finn does. You are human insofar I recognize you as the one who could be forgiven by me. Not that they should, but who could. It's what I call the availability of forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
But I also need to recognize myself as the one who would accept being forgiven. That in a sense, I would remain available on the scene, as it were, to be the one who is forgiven, rather than saying, I'm not even going to show up to be forgiven.
Thank you.
Which is itself a kind of violence.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for your thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Ackerley. Well, I see it's 6:30, and that might be a fitting place to conclude the question period. I'd like to give you a chance if you have any last word, and then I'll end just by thanking everyone after that.
Well, I guess maybe it's two. One is, I mean, I regret that we weren't able to be together in person, because I think a lot of the questions and thoughts that were put forth in the question answer period, I mean, we could spend all night, and in a sense we should spend all night debating and thinking about these. So hopefully maybe in some not too distant future there might be an opportunity, but it was really, as I'm always skeptical that anything interesting can happen on Zoom. But I think this was, one of the rare occasions where, yes, there's a lot of things that I have to think about, ideas I hadn't sort of, come up with. So like everything, it means that my thinking is still very much unfinished. So for that, I'm very grateful.
Well, thank you. I want to thank everyone who attended. Thank you, Mr. Kingston, for being our intermediary and bringing Professor DeWarren back. And thank you very much for your talk, your engagement in the question period. And we will be thrilled to welcome you back to our campus in our town on the far side of all of this. But we do take great consolation in being able to have our conversations like this in the meantime. And I do think that this was excellent and gives us much to think about moving forward. So thank you so much. And everyone stay well and stay safe and stay sane, as we like to say. So.
And good luck with the rest of everyone's semester. Thank you.